Okay, so we are going to look at this idea of conservatives versus liberals from the 60s, or the end of the 60s rather, through 1980. So we're just going to cover a little bit of Supreme Court decisions, some social and cultural changes that take place, as well as a little on the Reagan administration and its policies. So let's look at what conservatism and liberalism actually means. Keep in mind, these two ideas have been in conflict throughout history, and at different points in time, political parties were considered conservative or liberal, just depending on the period you're talking about. Let me give you an example. So most people now know that Republicans are considered conservatives. However, if you go back to Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, they would have been considered liberal at the time based on the idea that they wanted this massive change, African Americans to no longer be slaves, to be given voting privileges, to be seen as equal under the eyes of the law. That's going to be significant and considered a liberal policy. But now we consider Republicans conservative. Those specific beliefs look at a continuum. They're not necessarily just affiliated with, one particular party. At times you'll see that, yes, like the Republicans right now, they are conservative. That may change in the future. We don't know. So this does shift. I'm going to let you read that little box on the right-hand side. These are some great, just common beliefs of the two parties, what they believe in, what you tend to see with a liberal person versus a conservative. So you have political positions that tend to be either socially conservative, socially liberal, fiscally conservative, fiscally liberal. Most people don't necessarily file themselves under one complete political party. In other words, there's a lot of Republicans that, may side more with a Democratic position on a particular issue. Let me give you an example. My dad tends to be a Democrat. I'm lucky I have both parties represented in my family. My mom is very much a Republican. My dad is very much a Democrat. However, my dad believes that abortion should not be legalized by the government. That's one of his areas. So even though he tends to side Democrat, he tends to vote Democrat, that's a particular issue that he tends to be a little more conservative on. My mom, an example for her, I don't know if I have one off the top of my head. She's pretty much a Republican. However, there are some areas, and let me give you an example. Actually, I do have an example. So most of the time, the Republican Party does not side with labor unions. They do not like workers' representation. They think that, it's an outdated idea. However, my mom 100% fully supports teachers' unions. She was a teacher, and she saw some issues when she was a school teacher. She has seen some issues as I am a school teacher. So even though she is a Republican and the Republicans tend to side with or against labor unions, she is one that actually, that's an area where she would side with labor unions. So kind of interesting. Political parties, swing with public opinion to become more conservative or liberal in order to reflect the concerns of voters. And that's true. You'll see that parties will shift their stances depending on how people react to certain issues. It's kind of interesting now with COVID going on that you see, the Democrats in terms of like where they are on this issue and what they are saying and what they believe in and how involved they want Trump to be or don't want Trump involved to be. Like, for example, the Democrats tend to side with the middle class and be very pro-worker, but they're the party right now that's, complaining about going too fast about reopening things. And it's just interesting. They will, kind of shift their viewpoint depending on what the people want. Or when a new issue comes up, like what we're going through now, you'll see some, party shifting in terms of like a normal stance versus, adjusting to what society actually wants. So anyways, let's talk about some differences in conservatives and liberals in the 80s. This develops because of some 20th century events. If you look at what we've covered, we've had the Great Depression that changed the role of the government in the economy because of the New Deal. That was an economic upheaval for every American. At that point, the Civil Rights Movement is also an example of, this upheaval of change that happened after World War II is over, and the Great Society, under Johnson, changing this idea the government should be more involved, should make sure that Americans in poverty have these programs to help them. And that was a radical idea at the time. Also consider, too, that there were social upheavals that strengthened the appeal of conservatism. So for a lot of Americans that are conservative, they don't want the government involved. The idea of race. Southern conservative backlash was fueled by this race riots that were occurring up north. And there were race riots up north. Detroit is one of those areas that they had significant problems. And so when people read about this, they said, oh, we want to return, to this normalcy where things aren't, in this state of upheaval. And unfortunately for some, it was, well, then blacks should be kept in their place. I don't personally believe that, but that was the thought of conservatives at the time, in the South especially. Johnson's Great Society programs were also seen by conservatives as a way of helping blacks at the expense of whites. So you're putting in all these programs to help African Americans. Even though many whites were benefiting from the program, they looked at it, well, it's a program to help blacks. It's not helping us. Therefore, we should do away with the program. They targeted specific anti-poverty programs as well as affirmative action took place. And their argument was that these programs are too expensive. It's going to increase taxes for people. And they said it increases or encouraged reverse racism, where we're catering so much to African Americans that you're actually discriminating against whites by giving in and helping that particular group. Again, not a personal belief, but just kind of an explanation of why, what the thought process was. In addition to that, you also had the women's rights movement. This movement challenges these ideals about what women's role was in society, to raise babies and be at home and cook and clean and, do those kinds of things. In addition to that, conservatives were not happy because of the Roe versus Wade decision that allowed abortion legally in the United States. This starts the right to life movement or the pro-life movement to make abortions illegal again. In addition to that, you also have liberals that believe that the individual should have the right to make choices, the pro-choice, idea or movement. There's also kind of a third area that people don't talk about, but there's some people that are strict constitutionalists that say, look, that's not the government's job to make a decision one way or another. Roe versus Wade should never have been a thing. It's not the government's business. That's a medical decision. So even though you might say like, oh, pro-life, pro-choice, and then it's none of their business. That's another stance that we don't often bring up. So in addition to this upheaval, keep in mind too that there were conservatives that opposed the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Liberals support it, conservatives did not. However, I have to point out the fact that President Reagan, who was a Republican, who was conservative, did appoint the first female to the Supreme Court, and her name was Sandra Day O'Connor. That's her picture there on the right. She is, or was, rather young or much younger when she was appointed. This is a more modern picture, but she's getting older. And in addition to those issues, you also have the Vietnam War. This is going to intensify this generation gap between the youth of the time and their parents. Of course, conservatives tended to be hawks. They wanted to continue to fight the war. We'll talk about why here in a second. Liberals tended to be doves. And keep in mind that anti-war protests actually angered the conservatives. They also were concerned with the fall of Vietnam to communism, that this kind of fortified their stance, because they were afraid that America was going to lose its power and we were going to lose this war against communism. There's a lot of movies, 60s, 70s, even in the 80s, and some into the 90s that, go against Russia, the Soviet Union, show them as the enemy, and then, encourages this fear against communism becoming this global power. In addition to that, in the 60s, you have the sexual revolution. There were couples that were engaging in sexual behavior, having sex outside of wedlock, which during this time period was not something that had been seen before. So it was shocking for a lot of Americans that, didn't engage or didn't feel like that was something that people should be doing. You also had increased drug use at the time. Again, this was something that was done out in the open and widely known, widely seen, as well as the divorce rate going up. And so there's conservatives that say, man, we're moving away from our family values of the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy households. We need to get back to that. And a lot of people will compare the 80s to that 50s time period where, there's this push for mom, dad, and the kids and the dog, to be around the table eating supper, and, life is grand and everybody's happy and everybody's together. Just a comparison. I don't necessarily think they're 100% in sync, but just a thought. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of Republicans. Because of these issues, because of this pushback against what had happened in the 60s, Nixon will be elected in 1968. He promises to restore law and order amid this social turmoil with the protests, with civil rights, all those problems. He uses something known as the Southern Strategy. And this was to or really where that shift in the parties, like oftentimes people ask me, well, how did the African Americans go from supporting Republicans because of Lincoln to the Democratic Party, like we saw like with voter turnout in 2008 with Obama? Well, this is where the shift starts to happen. It starts with Kennedy, where Kennedy as a Democrat is pro-civil rights movement. And not that the Republicans were anti. You remember Eisenhower sent in the military to protect the Little Rock Nine. But Nixon kind of feeds off this idea. He looks and he says, okay, I would argue he's kind of an opportunist, or is an opportunist, not kind of. He looks at the issue and he said, okay, there's a lot of people that aren't happy with civil rights. I can't change everything, but I can appeal to these people and say we're going to lessen government involvement in civil rights. And there were Southerners that, this appealed to. There were some Northerners that this appealed to. But basically, this is where you see this kind of change in the Republican Party. It's not overnight, but it does happen with Nixon. He uses it as a political strategy to gain votes. The new right, keep in mind, it has this wave of fiscal and social conservatism. They're going to keep the government out in terms of money. We're going to turn it over to the states and let them fund it, or let them provide, the parameters for legislation. Medicaid is an example of this. So people that are on Medicaid, the money usually comes from the federal government, but the states determine who qualifies, how they get that card, who qualifies. In some cases, it's just children. In other cases, it's just a poverty line, and, anybody can get on it. It depends on the state where you live. So that's going to be a shift. That's an example of him turning over power to the states. You also had some businessmen that opposed environmental protections that had been put in place because it was limiting economic freedom. In other words, limiting the money that they could make. You also have social conservatives that oppose abortion. And then what ends up happening is you have fundamental evangelicals, or evangelical Christians, I'll just fill that in, that wanted to reinforce morality. So they start to become more conservative. My mom is actually a great example of this. She was an evangelical conservative, or is an evangelical conservative, and she tends to vote Republican. I told you my parents are split. It's kind of interesting in the household during elections, to say the least. If any of you live in those kinds of household, bless you, because it's not easy. So evangelical churches become this cornerstone for this movement. They're the ones, the Republicans want to return to, the conservative values, so the church is going to support that. You have televangelists. A good example, Billy Graham is on TV in the 50s. He comes back in the 80s and has a very strong presence on television. You also have this 24-hour news cycle that also helped to increase this gap between political parties by talking about, how they're different than the other, as opposed to uniting. Fox News is an example now. Fox News does not necessarily exist as we know it during the 60s and 70s, but there are others during this time that are good examples of that. So let's talk about, how did the conservatives fall? Because Richard Nixon is a Republican conservative. Ford will be a conservative. However, the person elected after Nixon, I'll explain how Ford was not elected and became president here in a second, is considered more liberal. So the Watergate scandal, President Nixon, you can see the meme on the side when he says, well, if the president does it, then it's not illegal. That was his stance on the presidency. He thought that the president's actions, regardless of what he did, if the president did it, it was okay because the president had ultimate power. He will find out that that's not true. So in a nutshell, again, if we were in class, this would be, a day or two that we would spend and look at this. But in a nutshell, Nixon, he is accused of orchestrating, being a part of at some level. We don't really know how much or when he knew this was going to take place, or if he knew it was going to take place. We do know that he found out about it at some point, before or after, during, no idea. But at some point he does find out that the Democrats, that the Republicans, members of his political campaign organization, have broken into Democratic headquarters and stolen documents. In other words, they went in, they looked to dig up dirt, find out what the political strategy of the Democrats were going to be for the election, so that they could counter and make Nixon look better. The silly thing is that Nixon won this election in a landslide. He did not need that information to win. It did not help him win. But he has some paranoia and is known for being a little nervous. And so this information, regardless, they got it, and they get caught getting it. Eventually, this whole thing unravels, and they figure out that at some point Nixon knows about it. And it's not a problem. If Nixon would have came out and said, like, look, they operated under their own circumstances, they did this on their own, I did not authorize this, I'm against it, you need to punish them, then this whole thing probably would not have gone the way that it went, with Nixon resigning at the end. So Nixon tries to cover it up, and that's where the problem lies, in the cover-up. Not the lie, but the cover-up. And so what ends up happening is that Gerald Ford ends up taking